Alright, so for today's session, basically what we want to talk about is going to be doing macros. And kind of the definition of a macro in this sense is a macro is basically anything that you can set up in the system that runs automatically on a schedule that does stuff for you. So some really common macros are just you want to send a follow-up for an estimate, or you want to have the system automatically send out the invoice, or you want to kind of send customers their statements at the end of the month, things like that. So you can set the system to kind of automate certain those things, or even if it's not fully automated, to help you out with those. So like I said, the most common ones are, we'll start off with the kind of marking. When you mark an order sale, what you can do is have the system automatically send out the invoice to that customer. So all the macros are going to be done. If you go here, you got marketing, and then macro setup. So macros fall into a number of different categories. So depending on what type of macro you want to do, depends on where you want to start. So you can do company macros, estimate macros, order macros. So the type of macro that you want to make kind of depends on where you want to start. So we wanted to see, the first one was going to be sending out the invoice when an order is marked sale. So that's going to be done under the order macros. And we'll say new macro. So the very first tab is the description. It's a pretty straightforward tab. It's going to put the category of where you start the macro. You can give it the macro name. So I want to say email invoices on order save. And then a description is just for anyone that kind of goes back to review these macros. So you can put a description on there, but it's not going to matter anything other than someone kind of reviewing the macro. Okay, so we'll do that. So the first tab that matters is the trigger tab. And there's a couple different options here. So you have the option to run this macro automatically or run this macro on a schedule. So depending on kind of what macro you're doing, will determine which one you want to use. So in this case here, since we have a specific event that we want to trigger this, we're going to go ahead and say run this macro automatically. And then we can sell it to order change event. And then a change event has a number of different options loaded under here. So I could do this macro, we could fire it on new order, you could fire it on a status change of any status, station change. You have lots of different triggers that you can use to fire off this macro. So the trigger that we wanted is I want to do a change event of a order status change to, and then sale. So that's all we have to do for the trigger. Now, depending on how you have your system set up, will determine the next option, which is this run on server in the background. If you have your system set up to use the internal email option, then you can tell this to run on the server in the background, which will basically automatically send out that invoice once you mark this as sale. However, if you have your system set up to use the Outlook email, you can't really use that option. And the reason for that is Outlook will basically, anytime something tries to send something through Outlook, it looks for confirmation of something being sent. So basically then, if you're using Outlook, you can't really run it on the server in the background because it's going to look for a prompt that's not going to be there. Now, if you want it to do it from your system, you can uncheck that option, and it will try to run the macro through your system, and then use your, it'll pop up the email when you mark that order of sale, and we'll go through and let you send that out. So it'll pop up everything that you need to send it. You'll just have to manually hit the send button. So that all depends on how your email options are set up. So we'll go ahead and say run on server. So that brings us to the last tab, which is the actions. So you have a load of different actions that we can do. You can do a macro that runs another macro. You can do a status change, or a status change, station change, a number of different actions. So with that, we wanted to look at, there's two ones that we're interested in. There's an email macro, which just fires out a pure email. It doesn't have any attachments to it. It just lets you send out the email. Then you can also do a report macro crystal if you actually wanted to attach a file to go with it. Since we're wanting to send out the invoice to the customer, we're going to say report macro crystal. So we do that, and if you take a look here, there are two actions that are kind of automatically included. There's a prompt and a notify completion. Now, if you are going through and wanting this to do automatically, you want to remove the prompt and the notify because, again, if this was running on the server, no one would be there to allow that prompt. So we can select those actions from here and delete those actions. So we're back to our report macro. So what I can do is give it a name. So I'm just going to call this invoice. And here's the important part, and that is this print option. So we want to make sure that we tell this to do a quick email whenever it goes to send this out. So then, if you have a custom invoice report, you can link to that through this file location here. You click on Browse, and it will go to that location. Otherwise, if you just want to use the system report, I can go here and say System Report. Pull that down and go to order underscore invoice master 01 is our standard invoice. And then if I go here, I can click on the Options tab, and just like whenever you're running a regular invoice, you can go through and set up the options for how you want that to send out. The main thing here is going to be under the email section, because this is where you can specify how the email is going to be sent when the macro fires. So you can tell it to go to a particular person using merge fields. So I can send this to, under merge fields, I can go and say the contact, and then the contact email address. And that would automatically send this invoice to the contact and send it to their email address. And there's a number of different merge fields that you can use to play around with. So you can use like the company name, the order number, the order description. You can essentially use those fields to build your email message out to whatever you want to say to the customer when they receive their invoice. And you can also do that same thing with the file name. So I can go here and call the file invoice and then merge field, order number, and order number. So whenever they receive their email, the file is going to be called invoice and then whatever the number is, instead of just standard invoice like it is by default. So basically, as far as the first macro goes, that's all it takes to set up a macro. Once you get your description, trigger, and actions all set, if the action is, or if the trigger is a automatic trigger, once I save this, that macro is now ready and in place to be run. So there's nothing that you have to do to run it. It'll just run automatically when you complete that particular trigger. So there's also another set of macros that we can do. So that was for happening whenever there is a trigger event. So we want to talk about a how to kind of talk about follow-up activities, because this they can happen in a little bit different ways. So we're going to talk about how to do a macro that uses an advanced explorer. So what I want to do is maybe at the end of the day, I want to shoot out an email of all the estimates that were created a couple days ago. So what I can do is if I go first, create a query. So if I go and say explore estimates, and we can use the options and advanced search criteria, and click on Modify Criteria, and let's expand that out. What I can do is clear here and build a query that shows me whatever I want to see. So I said I want all estimates where, let's see, I want to do the status is still pending, and let's say the estimate created date was 5 days ago. So I want to go and say estimate created date was equal to 5 days ago. And obviously you can adjust these macros and these options as you see fit. We also have this shift dates, so that means if I run this macro tomorrow, it'll be 5 days from tomorrow and not kind of stick on the 23rd. So you do want to make sure that option is checked. So I want all estimates where the status is pending, and the estimate created date was equal to 5 days ago. In this case here, I may not get anything. I don't know if we've created any estimates 5 days ago, and in this case here, we haven't. But we can still go through here and save that query. So estimates created 5 days ago. So that gives us a query then that we can now tie to a macro. So if I go to back to the marketing, back to the macro setup, this time we're going to do an estimate macro instead of the order macro. So what I can do is do a new macro here. Macro name is going to be estimates from 5 days ago. So this is where it's going to differ a lot from our original macro. That's going to be if I go here and say run this macro manually or on a schedule. So last time we did a automatic macro because we had a specific trigger of when something happened. But this time we kind of want to say take this entire grouping of options and then send something out based off of those. So we do this, run this macro manually or on a schedule. And what we can do is say, use the save query. So if I do that, that query that we created just a second ago for the estimates created 5 days ago, we can now select within this section here. So you can do macros based off of a query that kind of looks at all the information that you run and say, give me that information. So we say, estimates created 5 days ago. And we'll go here again. And just like last time, we're just going to do another action. This time I'm just going to do a straight up email macro. And remove our 2 prompts. And I can just say this time, let's say I have a specific person I want to send this email to. What I can do is get rid of this option here where it says sending it to the entered by. And I just want to send it to a particular person. And then your merge field would be estimates. And then merge field is going to be the estimate number. Is at 5 days. So you can send that to yourself, you can send that to a department that you have, you can send it to the customer. You can specify who you're going to send that email to, but basically what we're setting up is that way this macro will send out an email for each of those estimates that is at 5 days old. So unlike the other macro, once we save this one, we're not done with it yet because we created that macro. Well, how does it know when to run this macro that is looking at these 5-day-old estimates? So this is the type of macro that if you set it up to not run automatically, you have to schedule it out.
Hey, Kyle, can you hear me? This is Kristen at Sirius.
Yes.
Hey, sorry to interrupt you. We still have some folks coming over from the previous session, so if we could just wait a couple more minutes and run through this example again. I apologize for the confusion that we had, but we had some greater interest in this session than the other account would allow for, but I think the last couple folks are joining us now, so if we could just run through this example again, that would be great.
We are recording the session if you wanted to put that up later as well.
Okay, that's good. That's great to have for those folks too. But if we could just wait maybe a couple more minutes to see if those folks come over and then run through this, that would be great.
Do you want me to run through both examples that we did, or just the first one, or what do you want? What would you want me to redo?
Probably would be good to go through just a quick overview again, and then maybe talk about your first example and then run through this one again in detail.
Because I did have a couple more examples I was going to go through after this one that might be better. I don't know.
Oh, great, great. So maybe just in 2 minutes if you could kind of frame it up again about what we're going to talk about and then pick back up with this example and then show your others, that would be great.
Okay, yeah. I'll wait a minute. I'll review the first one. I'll finish this one up, and then because the next macro that we're going to do is going to be real similar to this one. So awesome. I guess I'll go ahead and mention this then in terms of, for everyone that is here, is the nice thing about macros is a lot of the tools and a lot of the tricks and how they work are really interchangeable. So if you do one type of macro, a lot of what you can, a lot of how it works will apply to any other macro. So kind of seeing how they're built, you can build just about any other macro like that. So, I could have went to the estimate and did a macro similar to the first one, which was give me an estimate that was converted to send out an email. So I could have done the same thing, and the rules would have been almost the exact same as our first macro, just a slightly different trigger. So it sounds like there are still some people trickling in, so I guess we'll just wait a moment and I'll do a quick recap of what we did real quickly and then finish up this macro that we're in the middle of. So I was not expecting that type of turnout. All right, we'll see. It looks like it's died down a little bit.
Yeah, Kyle, I would go ahead and
Okay.
get started again. And sorry for the interruption, but thank you.
Okay, yeah, so what we're going to do real quick is I'm going to just recap real quickly the first macro. I'm not going to go through the entire process, but some of the aspects that I talked about on it, I'll incorporate into the macro that we're in the middle of. So basically, the first thing that we covered on this call was we did a real simple and probably the most common macro, which was a macro that will go ahead and automatically send out the invoice once you mark an order of sale. That doesn't require any input from you. It just goes through, and when you mark that order of sale, it either will send the email automatically or prompt you through your Outlook, however you kind of have your email settings set up. And all these macros are reached through going to, if you click on Marketing, and then macro setup. And then that's where you can go through and you can do a different, depending on what type of macro that you want to do, is you can do a company macro that sends a macro for an individual company, or an order macro if you want to send out a macro for each individual order. Kind of depending on what information you're looking for will determine the macro that you want, the macro category that you want to work with. So using the macro that we've kind of started, I'll just go through some of the concepts that we did mention there. And the first macro, which is when you're doing a macro, the first tab is your description tab. And that's basically just where you name your macro, give it a description. The second tab is where you tell the macro, how is this macro going to work? Is it going to be a macro that is run automatically, so it happens through a action that happens through the system? So that would be, a new order, or an edit of an order, or a new contact in a company, or a payment received. Anything that kind of has a specific action that could trigger this macro, you can set to run automatically. Whereas the macro that we're working on here is, instead of saying this run macro automatically, if you run something manually or on a schedule. So if you don't really have a specific action that would trigger this, you just kind of want to send out, at the end of the month, you want to send out a statement, or at the end of the week, you want to send out an email to everyone that placed an order that week. Or if you don't really have a specific action that controls your macro, you just want to send something out to a group of people based off a set of criteria, that's where you want to use this macro manually or on a schedule. So for this particular one, what we did is we created a query that said, give me all the estimates that are in the system that are created 5 days ago. So we tied that to our macro, and then on the actions portion here, there's a couple of different actions that you can use. And it's one of those things that doesn't hurt to go through and maybe play around just to kind of see what some of these actions are, because going through each one individually would take a good chunk of time. But most of them are pretty self-explanatory, because you can tell a macro to run another macro. In our case, we're looking at the email macro and then the report macro. Crystal are the two most common ones, but there are a number of different actions. So with this one, we have our trigger. It's set to estimates created 5 days ago. On the actions, I have it set to not replace the to field and just automatically email me and let me know estimate number X is at 5 days old. So we have our macro created, but like we mentioned earlier, there's not really a specific action that tells this macro to fire. So what we're going to do then is, if I go back to the marketing here, we did the macro setup to set up the macro. Then the bottom option here is to schedule that macro. So what I can do is, if I go to schedule macro, I can go and tell it description. So this is going to be to 5 days, and then I link it to whatever macro I want to fire. So in this case here, I want to link this to the macro that we just created, so estimates from 5 days ago. And then I will talk about this subject again, which is, this was tied back to the original macro. If you set it to run automatically, you have this automatically run either on the server in the background or never. So what that means is, if I tell it to run on the server in the background, that means that I have to make sure that my email settings are set up in such a way that it's going to use the internal email and not Outlook. And the reason for that, again, was Outlook requires a prompt for anything that's trying to access it. So if you have it set to run on the server, those macros would get caught up in Outlook's kind of third-party checker. If you have it set to never run automatically, when that macro triggers, it'll trigger it from the computer that schedules this macro. So you can use it to run Outlook, but again, that's something that you'd have to be there to kind of manually send out those emails if you have it set to use Outlook. So whenever you're using macros and you want to do things automatically, getting some assistance either from our tech team or, if you have it already set up that way, to use the internal email will ensure that those macros fire without getting caught in any of Outlook's kind of third-party things. So we're going to say run on the server in the background, and then you can schedule it to run at a particular time. Typically macros are good to run either at the end of the day or the beginning of the day, just because while they're running, they can slow your system down if it's trying to send out a couple hundred emails. So we'll go ahead and say we'll just set this for 7 a.m. So once we have that set, what we can do is tell it to make recurring. And that's where this comes into the scheduling portion, because I can tell it to make recurring. This can tell me that it needs to be saved before we can make it recurring. We'll say yes. And this is where I can tell it to, I can run this weekly, I can run this on a daily basis, monthly, depending on what type of macro it is, you can tell it how often to run. So since we're checking for these emails that are at 5 days old, this is something that I'd want to run every day. So I can tell it to run daily, recur every day, schedule ahead X number of months. That basically just tells you how many pre-scheduled activities is it going to put for this macro. I don't like to do the entire 6 months just because I think it clutters up the calendar. It doesn't really matter all that much. It's just how many pre-scheduled activities is it going to create for you. And then you can set up an end date. So like if you had a macro that did like a promotion email that you ran every day for a month, you could tell it to run a certain number of times or end on a certain date. So you can tell it to, not end at all, or if it's a promotional type macro, you can tell it to run for a particular time frame before it ends. So since this is just checking emails, we don't really need an end date. So I can say here, no end date, click OK, click OK, and my macro is now scheduled to run. So at 7 a.m. every morning, this macro is going to try to run and go look for any of these estimates that are at 5 days old and send those out. So that is it for the estimate macro. So the macros and their conjunction with the Advanced Explorer can be real powerful. And like I said, for the advanced query stuff, if you want to get some more information on that, we can cover those on the webinar as well. Or you can contact the consulting department and we'll kind of go through and do a training session with you on the individual things that you can do with the advanced query stuff. But that's a completely different topic we can save for another time. Going back to the macro stuff, so if we go and look at a company macro, if I go here and say, so here's another common one that comes up, company macro, and if we go here for the trigger, again, so you have your run macro automatically. You got on the company macro, you got certain triggers you can do on a new company. So if you wanted to send out some type of, if you have like a credit form or something that you send out to every new company, you could do something like that. For every time that you go through and do something on that company record, you can tie a trigger to that. If we go to this run macro manually or on a schedule, I believe in this case, let me see what we've done. I believe we've had a couple pre-created macros here. No, maybe not. So I'm going to go create a query real quick because this is another common one. This is related to the estimate follow-up one, but a lot of people like to go ahead and kind of send out statements to their customers. So what we can do is go through here and say explore companies, options, advanced criteria, modify criteria. So I want to say I want all companies where they have orders that are in sale and they have a balance outstanding of greater than 1 cent. Basically, we're just saying, give me all the companies that have an AR balance in the system. So that's going to give me the 3 companies that currently have a AR balance. I can save that query. And then back to our macro setup, I can go and say, use this query, companies with balances due, actions, and then that would be, this time we can do a report macro crystal. And under the system report, there is a accounting all account statement. So just like we set up the invoice macro on the other company record, what I can do is say that. We'll say the print option is a quick email. Remove our 2 prompts. And then from here, again, just like with the invoice, you can set up the options for how you send out the statement and what the email is. The biggest change here would be on the to field. What you can do is under the merge fields, last time how we did the contact, what we can actually go here is say company, and then accounting contact email is what you can use as the email address for the statement. So with that, again, I would go ahead and set up that particular email. So we go through here, we'd be able to put in the subject, your statement. And then we can go and say, we'll save that. Oh, I forgot to give it a name. Company statement. Save that. We'll go back to our marketing here, schedule macro. And with the scheduling, you don't have to select the category like you would with actually creating a macro, because the category is basically pulled up from here because it pulls all things. So I got my macro here for the company statement. So we can do that one. We run that one at 6:30. I try not to run macros at the same time if we're scheduling them, just to kind of give them time to run. So usually a 10 to 15 minute difference if you're running multiple macros on the same day isn't a bad thing to do. So I would run this one at 6:30 on the server, and we'll do our make recurring. The biggest difference here is obviously I don't want to spam the customer with their statement on a daily basis. So what we'd want to do here is I can go and tell it to run monthly. And then I can tell it to do it on a couple of things. The first weekday, I can do it on the last weekday. You can tell it to when you want to schedule that particular macro. So I want to do it on the last weekday of the month is when we want to send them out their statement. And we'll say, we'll schedule that one 2 months. And that is that macro ready to go. So with the macros, really, it's one of those things that if you don't do a bunch of email type things, there's something that's kind of useful to get in there and just play around with, just because the sheer amount of options, the sheer amount of things that you can do between all the different macro types. You can do company macros, contact macros, estimate macros, order macros, just the sheer number of options that you can have to kind of help you automate things that you do in the system would be things that are good for macros. And on a kind of a general level, things that are good for macros are just if you have processes that you do all the time and it happens under certain conditions or certain things that you kind of want to just have help with on scheduling it and stuff like that, that's really a good thing to consider for a macro. So, emailing out the invoices, emailing out statements, follow-ups, just anything that you kind of do on a regular basis is something good that you can try to do for a macro. If it's something that you do maybe once every 3 or 4 months, that may not be a good thing for a macro just because there's not really a good precedence to set up something that will be used on a very low basis. And as far as the macros go, we just kind of touched on the surface here. There's lots of extra little things that really we can do with macros because we can incorporate SQL triggers into them. So we could say, on that orders thing, we can create a macro that says, send out the invoice to the customer whenever they mark an order of sale, only if the company has this particular UDF for send out statement, send out their invoices by email, UDF checked. So we can do lots of extra little conditions and things that would be a little bit more time to set up for this type of call, but there's lots of extra improvements and things that we can talk about. So if you ever had any individual questions on doing a macro or just looking for some assistance with making a macro, or just kind of question to see if something can be done, definitely contact our consulting department, and we can either schedule a time to help you out with that macro. We can answer it through an email saying, yes, all you have to do is this, or no, we can't do that. Just kind of letting us know what you want to do with a macro. We can help you out with a lot of those questions. And there are a couple of videos already on the setup steps page for the basic training videos that kind of talk about these macros as well. So like I said, I know there's a lot more that we can go over with this, so I think let's go ahead and open the floor for any questions. I'll try to answer anything individual. As mentioned, we have a very large chunk of people on here, so if you have a couple of questions, if you want to go ahead and type them in the chat box, I'll go through as many questions as I can. And while we're waiting for them, I'll just see if there's anything else I can talk about in terms of the macros on here, just because, yeah, there's a lot we can do. Okay, so we have a question here. Can you, just like I said, I'm going to try to take these out from the top on down. So first question is, can you BCC or CC multiple contacts? And the question there is, so if I go to the macro, and I'll just do the order macro that we had set up. So what I can do is, yes, you can go through here, and under the email section I can say the contact email address, and then I could do a semicolon and then put a merge field on there and do the company accounting contact email, and then I can go to the CC and I can CC myself on it, and then I can go to the BCC and put someone else on there. So you can put as many different fields in there for the email section as you want, and you can use multiple merge fields, and you can also just do a mixing of merge fields plus hard-coded things. So if I had the department here, I can say, invoicing at Sirius.com in addition to everything else that's on there. So you can BCC and CC or just regular send out to multiple contacts. Okay. Next question is, how many actions can you add to a macro? I don't know what the limit is. And what I mean by that is literally I could just go in here and just keep adding actions. I don't think there's a limit other than maybe what would just drive you crazy trying to keep track of. But as far as I know, I haven't yet run into a limit on the number of macros. So your limit there is mostly just how much can you feasibly work with before you drive yourself crazy. Okay, so the next question is how to trigger another macro with a macro. So that one, basically what you're going to want to do there is, let's say, trying to think, this was one that if I had time to make an example, it'd be a little bit better, but I'll try to test something out. So I want to go ahead and have a macro that will send out a thank you. So I want to say order macro here, new macro, and we'll say thank you. The trigger on here is going to be a run this macro manually or on a schedule, and we're going to say use the current order. And then my action will be just an email here, and we'll just say send it to the customer's contact, so I can use the field up here, the order estimate service ticket contact, and just say subject is thank you. So whatever, basically you set up a macro that has whatever you want to be, and it's going to be usually often an individual order or individual estimate. And it's going to be set to manually or on a schedule. So that way now, what I can do is if I go here to order macros, if I go back to my email invoices on order save, what I can do is if I edit that macro, I can go here and say actions, and then another macro, and then I can tell it to run that thank you. So what's going to happen here is it's going to run my report macro for sending out the invoice, and then it's going to go and run this thank you macro and basically send out the thank you email through a separate macro. Obviously that's a little bit of a convoluted way of doing that. I could just put the thank you on here as an email, but that's just showing you that you can use a macro and run any other macro, but that other macro that you want to run is going to be looking at the, you're going to want to say to use the manual on a schedule. You can't really run an automatic macro to run another automatic macro because that creates macroception. So that's it for the running another macro. And basically, the next question is related to that, and that is how to fill in a UDF field. And for people that don't know, a UDF is what's called a user-defined field. So depending on what type of macro, so this one here is another good one. So if we have a email invoices on order save, so we have it set to run, again, this macro set to run on a status change of sale. If we have a UDF or user-defined field, and what those are basically fields that you kind of create on the company or on the order, kind of you create those fields within the system. And what we can do is there's a action here for user-defined field macro. So if I go ahead and run that macro, what I can do is you can tell it to run the different categories. So we want to run a order UDF, company UDF, so you can tell it which UDF to run off of, and then you can tell it what type of UDF. So let's say I want to say when this is marked sale, we want to go through and tell it that I'll just pick something. We'll say that the ship due date is set to today. So I can say this UDF set the value below and then I can tell it to only do if this UDF isn't set. So we can say, when this macro runs, to set a UDF on that order to be marked sale. What the importance there is, a lot of people will do macros that say, hey, run this for any order that is over X days. Well, if you don't have any other checks in there, if you have that macro set to run every day, then when it goes to check how many days is late, it's going to keep running that macro day after day after day after day. So what you can do is you can actually create, and as you saw on their list there, we actually had one for a 45-day reminder sent. So if you do a macro that kind of sends people a email letting them know that something is old, what you can do is go through and set up a UDF that is, after that macro runs, it checks that UDF. So within your query, you can tell it to don't run that macro if this UDF is checked, and that way you can prevent from spamming the customer their an email that they excuse me, you don't spam the customer with an email for that macro that's being sent out every single day. It sends it the one time, marks the UDF, and doesn't send it to them after that. So that way you can kind of use that as a bit of a spam prevention so you don't overwhelm your customer with emails. So you can do that on any of the other macros. So you can do that on a company estimate, just about any of the other macros that fire. You can use that user-defined field macro and set a particular UDF to a certain value. Okay. Okay, I don't think the next one, that might be a bug then. About, someone mentioned using the more than one email in the CC list isn't working. I might have to put that in as something to ask our dev team to look at. I'm not aware of that, so let me make a quick note of that, and then we'll come back to that one. So I'm going to copy that on here. So someone who was looking for some clarification on Outlook, basically if you have the Outlook set to use, or if you have your email set to use Outlook, you cannot use send the email on the server in the background. And that's not because of our system. That's because within Outlook, anytime that you try to send an Outlook email through Outlook, usually it pops up with a prompt that says, you know, there's a third-party program trying to access this program. Do you want to allow? So anytime that you have an email that goes through Outlook, usually it looks for some sort of confirmation before it actually sends it. So that's the reason why we can't use Outlook, is because Outlook itself has prompts built in to prevent third-party programs from sending something without user consent. So in most of those cases, you know, you can use Outlook on your local machine and have it send out those emails to not run on the server in the background, in which case then it will, when it tries to send something out for marking an order sale, it'll pull up the email with, you know, all the with the email information, the attached report, the email message. It'll pull up the email with everything on it, but you will have to manually send it because Outlook is looking for you to basically allow it to go. So that's really the main reason there, is the system sends it to Outlook just fine, but Outlook usually has a bit of prevention to prevent it from sending emails automatically, and that's why you can't use Outlook with things that you want to run automatically, is because it requires user input to send it. So so another question, does emailing a macro only work with Outlook, or can you use web-based email? That depends on how your email setting is set up. So when you set up your options, and this is kind of something that the tech team would help you out with, but under the setup and then system setup and then email options, here's where your email options are set up. So it's not going to be just Outlook when you go to use this. It'll be whatever email address. So there's a way to tie it to Gmail. You can tie it to whatever your other email service provider is. So, you know, whatever email settings you set up in here is what it's going to use to send that email out. But it needs to have the settings in here for the system to send out the email. So that's really kind of what we're getting at when we say the Outlook or internal is the email options that you see right here. Okay. Got a question, can a macro be triggered when we convert the estimate to an order? And the answer is yes. So under if we go to the estimate macros and new macro, one of the triggers under the trigger and then run this macro automatically is the estimate status is changed to and then converted. So you can create a macro that fires off when an estimate is converted. I might need some more clarification on this next question. It's looking for a macro for all invoices emailed on a weekly basis. So are you saying that you want to kind of, rather than sending out the invoice at the end of the day, you want to do a macro that sends out the all the invoices for that were marked sale during that week? So you kind of do more of a weekly batch of all the invoices rather than an email, or rather than an email once it's actually marked as a sale. I'll wait to see if that answer comes back up, but that's what I'm gathering from there. Okay, so the next comment is that basically a lot of the macros that we've been working with have been email related. So there are other things that we can do in the system. So one common one that actually comes up is, so I'm going to do a bit of a cleanup here. Okay, so one macro that does come up a little bit, and the way that I usually set this up is if I go, and I'll do a company macro, and if I do a new macro here, what I can do is on the trigger, I'm going to say run this macro manually or on a schedule, and I'm going to say use a saved query, run a query, and I usually, just to keep this simple, this is for something like this, and this will be made apparent here when I get to the action portion, but I just want to select a single record. So give me all the companies where the company name is equal to walk-in. That way, basically, I'm always guaranteed to get one record. So with that query, what I can do is under the actions, what I can do is we can do a number of different things here. So I can actually go here and say report macro action. So this is basically one that comes up for people that don't really do closeouts. What you can do is go to the macro action here, and you can say action, and I can do a backup of the database. So you can use a macro to do a number of different options. Some of them I probably recommend not tying it to a macro, because they show up just because they're considered actions in the system, but I would not recommend doing a close day as a macro. Now what you can do though is you can do a macro for, like I said, the backing up the database. You can do a macro for creating labor usage cards. So you can do a macro that does things other than emails. You can actually make a macro for, depending on what conditions that you have. So this would tie more into into some of the SQL things that we talked about, but you can actually create a macro that runs a message. So I could create something that has a trigger of run this macro automatically on a company that is created, and I could go and do a SQL thing that checks for a certain value that pops up a message. It doesn't actually do anything, but it just pops up a message on the screen. So you can do things other than emails with the macro. So you can do actions, you can do, like I said, we can do UDF changes when something happens. You can do things that don't involve emails whenever you are doing a macro. So the next question is, if you change your email to send through Control versus Outlook, will the emails still say they are sent from the correct email address? And so the answer there is it's going to send it through, it's going to show that the email comes from however you set up the email option under that system setup, and then under the email options. So however you set your email up within here is how it's going to look like to the customer when it sends out to the system. Because the system is not sending out the email on its own, because like any replies that you get are going to go to your main email system. We're just using that system to help facilitate sending the email, but the actual email itself is still handled through your email program. So if you set up your email here as kking@sirius.com, it'll still look like it's coming from that email, even though our system is sending it rather than Outlook sending it. I can't keep up with these. Look out. There is a bit of a discussion. There are some third-party programs. So this is something that I can't condone. I can't really. I can't really. It's things that we can say. Some customers have used work, but it's something I can't really fully support or say that it's a supported option. But there are some third-party programs that you can get that will allow clicking of some of those options in Outlook and let you send that. But again, that's kind of more, I can't really touch on that too much because I don't know much about them and not really serious supported, but there are some things that do work for that. So back to the other question. So I think this macro is something I can't do because the follow-up to the question that came up earlier about invoicing, sending out the invoices, is there's not really a way to query the system to kind of say when something is sent out unless you use a UDF. So what you could do is create a UDF on the company record, and that you can update yourself and say like when the invoice was sent, and then you could run a macro that you can run a query then that looks at that particular UDF and says, here's all the invoices this week that have here's all the invoices that have this particular UDF for invoice sent of this week, and kind of be able to send yourself or whoever you want to send a report of all those particular orders. But I can't really do a macro that looks at when something is sent because there's not really a field I can query off of unless you make that field. So it can be done, but it's something that you have to have a UDF set up to be able to query off of, because otherwise there's nothing for me to really look up. Okay, next question is, okay, so I think half of this can be done, but the other half can't. The question is basically, someone would like to have an email a payment receipt when they receive a credit card payment over the phone. So with that, there is again, I think, now that I think about it, basically what I can do is an order macro, new macro, and a trigger. So there is a trigger here for change event, and I can say a payment to an order. So as of now, basically it's going to be any payment that is received regardless of that payment type. This is something that probably would not be able to be covered on a webinar session like this. However, what we can do is, that's where the option I was kind of mentioning earlier about this indirect change event, because I could go ahead and set a query here that kind of says, I want to look at a payment on an order, and then we would go through and kind of say that the payment received was a credit card payment because there's typed in there. So we could kind of create a SQL that looks at that most recent payment and then goes through and says if that is a credit card payment, then proceed on with the macro. So that falls into kind of what we talked about here with the order change event, which would be it runs off of a payment on order, and then it does a secondary check of whatever SQL I write here. So I can say, I can look for this order, and the most recent payment is a credit card payment. So it's something that can be done. It's something you probably want to contact the consulting department to help out with, because it does require some SQL work to set that up. But I believe we can set up a macro that goes through and looks at a payment type that has been received. Okay. So the message pop-up, the downside to the message pop-up is it's basically only for the particular user. So I can show you that real quick because it's easy to set it up. Again, it's basically, that means message macros are only going to work on your local machine. You don't want to do a message macro that runs on the server, because it would try to run it on the server and no one would be there to get the message. So if I go here and say an order macro, trigger, and obviously I'm going to make this overly simple just so we get something, but you can be able to tie this more into something that you're looking for specifically. But I want to go here and say a order edited. So I'm going to go here to the actions and do a message action, and just says, your order has been, and then delete these other ones, and then save that after I give it a name. Like I said, this is probably not a macro that you would normally want to do, but just to kind of illustrate what it does. So if I go and say explore orders and pull up any order, edit, and do something, and save it, I do not get my, oh wait, Yeah, so that's obviously I meant to illustrate the fact that you can't run on the server. That's what I was going with there. So if I turn that option off and basically do the same thing, it's going to pop up your message, your order has been edited, and then whatever transaction had ran that particular message. So you could tie that to more along the lines of a couple other things. And actually one thing that it does do is if you're going to use a local email and you kind of want to confirm something's going to be done, is what you can do is back on the macro setup on the message action, there's an option there that says allow user to cancel the macro with this message. So if you have something that you want to be a prompt for a particular user, if you don't do it on the server in the background, you can set up the macro to actually cancel the macro before it runs all the way through by allowing it to cancel the macro before it actually runs. And if obviously this one's not going to make a big difference because actually I'll test this out. So I'm going to put one message and do a second message. So if we go back to our order and I edit and save that, it's going to give me your order has been edited, and it gives you an OK or cancel. If I click on OK, it's going to give me the second message. However, if I edit and save, and I go to that and I cancel it, it stops the macro right there. So you can set up a message macro for macros that you don't want to happen automatically, but you do want it to help generate the email and stuff for you. You can generate those messages for you and have it give you the option to cancel that macro before it runs through. But it is going to be on just the person that that triggers the macro, not for anyone else. So I can't make it like if I edit it, it's going to send a message to Bob who's logged in somewhere else. It's going to be just a personal message to whoever triggered that particular edit. This is a question about yes, you can, basically you're going to want to email the consulting@Sirius.com if you're looking for some assistance with setting up a UDF for doing any number of these macros. It's something that the consulting team can help out with. That's really more in our realm than it is tech support's realm. So, but it is definitely something that we can help out with. Just reading this next one. You can't really set up a macro to prompt for a UDF. Like you can have a macro that sets a UDF, but it's not really going to prompt for anything. It's going to have to be a set of conditions that are within the system. So, so on that front, I am kind of limited in terms of what I can prompt for on a UDF side. And to answer Monique's question, basically there is a question here that is saying, can we do a macro to issue a prompt that invoice was not emailed? And that kind of falls into the same thing where, that would be something along the lines of I could do a query that says, give me all orders that were marked sale over X days ago, and this UDF that we talked about setting up is not set. So just how we can check for the ones that were set within a week, I can check for all the ones that were never set. So that way we can say, here's everything marked sale where the UDF, where the emailed invoice UDF was never set. So you can use that same UDF and kind of go the opposite way with it, where you check for it if it's checked, and then we can check for it not being checked. So we can go both ways with that UDF. Okay, next question is, what is the difference between Crystal, Word, and SQL? So that question is referring to a couple of the different actions that are under here under reports. So you have Crystal report is really the main reporting thing that the system uses. Basically, that's going to be your invoice, your estimate, your statement. Any other regular reports that you kind of run from the system are going to be a Crystal report. SQL reports are things that we can generate that run a SQL query, and sometimes that might just be returning back information. Sometimes it might be I really wouldn't do I don't think I would do an update with that. Mostly it would just be going through and kind of just giving you a way to run a query without actually doing a report, which would just return back information. It's just another report type. So rather than being a report, you can go here and say, run this and say select order number. Basically, you would write up the report manually. And then the Word macro it doesn't come up very often, but there are a set of Word reports are basically, it's kind of used for envelopes and things like that, so they run through Word rather than through Crystal reports. So they're all just different ways of running reports within the system.